join us, and we hope that you find the presentation very informative. So this morning, we're going to begin by speaking on the data quality checks. If we can advance to the next screen, thank you. The data quality checks for indicators 7, 11, and 12. We plan to have those results in ADT by Friday, March the 25th. When you go into the ADT system, the file name should include the district name, the indicator name, and it should be labeled as February data quality check. Some data quality considerations to consider. During the pre-check, you want to make sure that you double check your data and want to make sure that you make corrections that's sent back to you during those pre-checks. You want to familiarize yourself with the data and review trending issues that you may find in your data, like trending issues that we send back to you. If you do not correct during the pre-check, you will not have an opportunity to correct in the final submission. So make sure that you make those corrections. This would be used on the LEA determinations. One other item I would like to bring up concerning the data quality check on indicator 12. I know that many of you are aware that we were having issues with the IEP date or the SPED exit date populating. We have been working with Enrich with that, and we were told that that should be fixed. So we are asking all districts, we're strongly suggesting that all districts submit for the April pre-check so that we can kind of see how that's moving and know how to get with Enrich on what updates we need or if it was fixed or not. So if you don't mind participating in that April pre-check, it's not mandatory, or I'm sorry, data quality check. It's not mandatory, but we're just asking that you all participate in order to make sure that we're aware that that is working properly for you. And I think next we'll go ahead and move into the presentation that Kelvin has set for you for significant disproportionality.
Thank you, Angia. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelvin Pompey, and we're going to discuss significant disproportionality for the remainder of this recording today. This will be an introduction to significant disproportionality, but I feel like this will be enough information for you to be able to implement the significant disproportionality analyses in your district if you so choose. As you all may know, the significant disproportionality analysis is a requirement of IDEA, Section 618D. Each state and territory is required to collect and examine data to determine if significant disproportionality based off of race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and in the LEAs within the state. We analyze significant disproportionality in 3 overarching classifications, as I'll call them here. We look at the disproportionality by race and ethnicity in the identification of children as a child with disabilities, or the identification of a child as a child with a specific disability. We also look at the placement of students with disability in restrictive environments or educational settings. And we also look at significant disproportionality by way of the incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions. And so historically, students with disabilities have been placed in restrictive educational environments based off of race and ethnicity. The same thing happens historically in terms of the disciplinary actions that students with disabilities have been assigned. And the same thing happens with the identification of students. And so the purpose is to evaluate whether that is happening in LEAs and to examine it, and then to see if work with districts to eliminate those disproportionalities. I said that there were 3 overarching categories of classifications in which we analyze significant disproportionality. There are actually 14 categories that are a little bit more specific. When it comes to the identification of students, there are 6 categories 7 categories. We look at the identification of children ages 3 to 21 for being identified as a student with any disability or one of these 6 disabilities that you see listed here. When it comes to the placement of students in restrictive educational settings, we look at school-aged children. Of course, that was previously ages 6 to 21. Starting in the 2020-2021 school year, we have the 5-year-olds in kindergarten included. And so we look at placement in regular class, less than 40% of the day. And we also look at a category of significant disproportionality for the placement in residential facilities or a separate school. So those are 2 categories for placement. When it comes to discipline, we look at in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions and expulsions totaling more than 10 days or less than 10 days, less than or equal to 10 days. And then we also look at the total disciplinary removals by incident. And that student population is the 3 to 21. So for each category of analysis, we'll look at disproportionalities in terms of each of these racial and ethnic groups, which is the 7 racial and ethnic groups that the federal government has identified. And so for each of those 14 categories, we look at disproportionality in each of these 7 racial and ethnic groups. The specific methodology that we use is a required federal methodology, and it is required that all states use a risk ratio in order to identify or conduct the significant disproportionality analyses. And basically, a risk ratio tells us how the risk for one racial ethnic group compares to the risk for a comparison group. And our comparison group in all of our significant disproportionality analyses include students who are not in that specific racial ethnic group, so all other races and ethnicities. For instance, if we're looking at significant disproportionality in Black or African American students, then my comparison group are all students in my district who are not Black or African American. So that's always going to be our comparison group. And this is for each of the 7 races and ethnicities. So it changes based off of which race or ethnic group we're looking at. Along with that methodology, we classify disproportionality as being significant by looking at what we call the risk ratio threshold. And basically the threshold is a value that's determined by the state over which disproportionality based off of race and ethnicity exists. And so states get to come up with or to determine which risk ratio threshold we have, and we'll go over the risk ratio thresholds for the specific categories of significant disproportionality as we move forward in the presentation. But if you're over that threshold, then that's sort of a trigger that you may have significant disproportionality in your district. And so since the methodology focuses on using risks and risk ratios, I want to do a review over some calculations of how we can calculate the risk ratios. And so these next few slides and these next large majority of our next few moments we have together, we'll be going over some calculations so that you can get acquainted with what we do in our office to make these determinations. And so first, because we use risk ratios, it starts out with being a risk. And so we want to review what a risk is. And statistically, a risk is basically a measure of how likely a particular outcome is. And so if I wanted to calculate the risk, and this is more of a general definition, all I have to do is count up the number of students with that particular characteristic and then divide by the total number of students. And so it's basically calculating a proportion or a percentage, which is what we usually use when we're counting up students and coming up with a number representative of a certain outcome. And so our risk can be expressed as a proportion and as a percentage. We get to choose, so on and so forth. And so I wanted to show this example, or start with this example, where we use these tables below to determine how likely it is, or to determine the risk, for an Asian student to be identified as a student with autism. And so when we do our significant disproportionality analyses, we like to disaggregate our data and present it in tables like this, which you see on the screen, where we have the number of students with the particular outcome that we're working on, or that specific category of analysis. As you can see here, we have the number of students with autism. separated or divided into their race and ethnic groups. And we also make use of that total as well when we're doing these calculations. In addition to that, for the identification categories, we need our full student enrollment disaggregated by race and ethnicity as well. And so the second table here, we have the number of students enrolled in our district. This includes all students, not just SPED students, but all students. And we have this here. And so if I wanted to calculate the risk for an Asian student to be identified as a student with autism, then I need to count up the number of students, Asian students with autism, and divide it by the total number of Asian students. And so I'll take, as we can see in this chart here, the 35 Asian students divided by the 1,403 Asian students that are enrolled, and that'll give me my risk for an Asian student to be identified as a student with autism. All right, and so we have these two interpretations here. Remember, we said that risk can be presented as a proportion or a percentage. And so one of the interpretations is the risk of an Asian student for being identified as a student with autism in this district is 0.025. Of course, the general public thinks more in terms of percentages. And so if you convert that to a percentage, we can say that in this district, 2.5% of Asian students are identified as students with autism. And so that's how we start our significant disproportionality analyses. We have to calculate the risk, or we need the risk for each of those race and ethnic groups and the comparison groups. So now we'll move toward our risk ratios. And basically, as we said before, the risk ratio is a measure of how the risk for one racial or ethnic group compares to the risk for the comparison group. And so basically, we calculate the risk for that racial or ethnic group, and then we divide it by, that's the comparison here, the risk for the comparison group. And that gives us our formula for our risk ratio. Again, we have to do this for each separate race and ethnic group respectively. And so I'm going to go back to that example with the same tables from before, and we're going to calculate the risk ratio that's associated with the identification of Asian students as students with autism. So looking at the same information. Now, we already had in the previous example the risk for students, for Asian students to be identified as students with autism. We took the number of students who are Asian with autism and divided by the number of Asian students. The only other information we need is the risk for the comparison group, which is the number of all other students with autism divided by the number of all other students enrolled. And so we can get that information from that same exact chart that we had on the previous slide. So I have it up here again, but now I'm going to make use of those totals in order to give me the number of all other students, right? Because if I want to know the number of all other students, and I know that I have 35 Asian students and a total of 1,096 all other students, then all I have to do is do a subtraction between those values, and that'll give me the number of all other students. Another way that you can do it is just add up the number of students in each of those categories. It'll give you the same value. But I will do that in this chart with the number of students with autism and in the other chart for the number of students enrolled. And I can put all of that information into our formula here. As you can see here, I had the 1,096, which is the total number of students in my district with autism minus the number of Asian students. And in here, I had the total number of students enrolled in my district minus the total number of Asian students enrolled. That gives me the risk for my comparison group. And I do this division of these two risks, and I get my risk ratio, okay? I can interpret my risk ratio by saying in this district, Asian children are 0.97 times as likely as all other children in my district for being identified as students with autism. So what does that mean? Well, if we go back to the top here, this first line, which says risk ratios, it's the division of two risks. And our goal here is to see if there's disproportionality. Well, disproportionality exists if the risk for one group is way higher than the risk for another group, right? And this division allows us to see that. Well, if there's no evidence of disproportionality, then when I divide these two risks, I should expect a value of 1, because the risk for each of the groups are equally likely. If this risk ratio value is less than 1, which we see in this case in this example, then that's evidence that the risk for students in that particular racial or ethnic group is less likely to be identified compared to the risk for the comparison group. Okay, so if it's less than 1, then those students are less likely to be identified. If it's greater than 1, that means that the risk for the students in that specific racial or ethnic group is more likely to be identified, and then of course placed or disciplined if we're looking at those categories, but they're more likely to be identified, and that is the highlight of disproportionality here. And so when we get a risk ratio and we get a value greater than 1, that's some evidence that these students in this racial ethnic group are disproportionately identified or placed or disciplined compared to students who are not in that racial or ethnic group. The larger that value is from 1, the more evidence there is for disproportionality. And so what we don't want to see is a lot of values that are much larger than 1 when we start to look at significant disproportionality. And so I'm going to stop here. Andrea, I saw that you went off mute. And so is there something that you wanted to address? Is there a question or anything? Anyone have any questions?
We had a few questions. We answered those. However, there is one that just came up. Do students identified in private schools factor into this calculation?
So, Wendy, yes, if those students are in your child count report, then yes, they will be factored into the calculation. So we use the child count report, and I'm going to go over all the data sets that we use. We use that child count report to get the number of students with the specific disabilities or the LRE placements. And so if they're in that file, then yes, they will be included in that calculation. Okay, and we're required by the federal government to use our child count report. So that's what we'll have to use. All right, any other questions?
Wendy is asking to be unmuted.
Okay.
Give me 1 second, I'll open up the chat here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Wendy, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Thank you. So I worked in another state for a long time and was blessed to be in SIGDISPRO for a while. So I appreciate you, Calvin, explaining all of the metrics behind it because it is confusing. My bigger concern is if the kids in private schools or home schools, which we don't have a lot of influence over their programming because parents decide to enroll them in that area. If we have a large number of kids identified as having autism in the homeschool or the private school, and then we're cited as significantly disproportionate, we don't have much influence at all in that programming. Mm-hmm. So I would just hope that the state would consider that when looking at people that are cited for significant disproportionality. And this is from lessons learned from a previous state.
Okay, and that brings up a good point. I do know that like we're required to use the child count report, the LRE placements, and all of that. Once the district is identified, they go through the process of doing the root cause analysis and all of that stuff. And then sometimes those things are taken into consideration with the identification or classification of a district as a district with SIGDISPRO. But for now, we kind of make those determinations with leadership. There are some times where our districts are excluded as a district with SIGDISPRO if we know that there's a for instance, I'm just going to make this example up. There's a school, a special school in the district, and they have a large population of students with a particular disability, and those students were identified or sent to that school by an outside agency or what have you. We understand that the district does not have control over that. And so we take those things into consideration before we make you go through all of those requirements that are designated for SIGDIS Pro. But there's a lot of stuff that we have to take into consideration to take you off that list for SIGDIS Pro, but there are considerations. I'll say that. All right.
Thank you very much.
So I'll move forward to alternate risk ratios, because risk ratios aren't the only thing that we do to make determinations of whether a district has SIGDIS Pro. And so if I can advance to the next slide, I want to talk about why alternate risk ratios are necessary. The main reason is that risk ratios are sensitive to small numbers. Some districts are really small, or some districts have student populations that are maybe homogeneous in terms of race or ethnicity, or they may have small populations of students with in certain race and ethnic groups. And so because the risk ratios are sensitive to small numbers, the federal government has required states to use the alternate risk ratio if they choose to use a minimum N or cell size in order to compensate for the sensitiveness of the risk ratio to small numbers. And I just want to review an example of why this may be necessary. And so I have two risks here, risk one and risk two. Risk one is 1 out of 4. Notice that the numbers 1 and 4 are very small relative to the risk in the fraction below that, 35/300, right? And so one of the reasons why risk ratios are sensitive to small numbers is because it's a division of numbers between 0 and 1. And when you divide very, very small numbers, they can kind of blow up really quickly. And so I wanted to use this example to kind of show you this case here. Suppose that I were to add 1 to each of those numerators in those risks. That would be equivalent to adding one additional student, right? Then this first fraction here would become 2 out of 4, right? Which meant the value of the increase from that first fraction was 0.25 units, just as a number, right? It doubled, right? That's a 100% increase, but that was an increase of 0.25 units. If I do the same thing for that fraction with that larger denominator, the 35/300, then I'm going to see that fraction become 36/300, and I'll see that there was only a 0.003 unit increase in that fraction from the 35/300. All right. Well, when I look at so you can already see the difference in the increases between those fractions, but let's look at what happens to the risk ratios. When I do the risk ratio doing risk 1 divided by risk 2 for that first column of values, my risk ratio is 2.143. However, if I look at my risk ratio when I do the second one, that is 4.167. And so we can think of that as being adding one additional student in a particular racial or ethnic group with that particular disability or placement or discipline. I'm doubling my risk ratio. That's the sensitiveness that we're talking about when we're saying that risk ratios are sensitive to small sample size. And so we use the alternate risk ratio to allow for disproportionality to still be analyzed for districts that a situation like this may occur. All right. And so the alternate risk ratio is a risk ratio, but it uses the district level data or the district level risk in that numerator for the specific racial or ethnic group. And it uses the state level data or the state level risk for the comparison group. So we're looking at the district level data on the numerator risk and state level data in the denominator risk. All right. How do we determine whether we're going to use a risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio? Well, it comes in using the minimum cell and the minimum N size requirements. The cell size, all right, I have a sample risk ratio here with some variables, A, B, C, and D in the place of the values that make up those risks. But the cell size refers to the numerators of both risks. And so my cell size is basically the top of each of those fractions that make up those risks. The N size refers to the denominators of those risks, so the B and the D, all right? States get to choose which minimum cell and N sizes they are going to use, because each state has populations in their districts that are different. During the recommendation from the federal government, a cell size of 10 or less and an N size of 30 or less was recommended by the federal government. With the help of our stakeholder group in South Carolina, we've determined to use the minimum cell size of 10 and the minimum N size of 30 in order to help us make the determination as to whether we're going to use a risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio. To make that decision, I have a flow chart here of some processing that we go through in order to help us make that determination. The first thing that we want to do to determine whether we're going to do a risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio or neither is to look at the numerator risk, the risk for students in that specific racial or ethnic group. We want to see if the numerator risk meets the minimum N and cell size. Remember, the cell size is 10 and the N size is 30. So that A needs to be greater than or equal to 10, and that B needs to be greater than or equal to 30 for that specific racial ethnic group in that category. If that is not the case, if the answer to that question is no, then we stop the analysis for that racial or ethnic group in that category, because the student population in that racial or ethnic group for that category is not large enough for us to make any disproportionality determinations, all right? However, if the answer is yes, A is greater than or equal to 10, B is greater than or equal to 30, then we want to go and check our denominator risk to see if it meets the minimum N and cell size. So I'm going to look at that C over that D for our comparison group. Remember, this is the comparison group in the denominator, the bottom fraction. And so if that value is greater, C is greater than or equal to 10, and that D is greater than or equal to 30, so that means that the minimum cell and N size have been met for that bottom fraction, then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate a regular risk ratio, just a regular risk ratio. If it is not, that means our comparison group doesn't have a large enough population to make a determination. And remember, with the alternate risk ratios, we replace district level data for a comparison group with state level data. So when that C is not less than 10, or when that C is less than 10 and that D is less than 30, we've not met the minimum cell and N size. And so we're going to calculate an alternate risk ratio. All right. And so this is the determinations we have to make to let us know whether we're going to calculate a risk ratio or alternate risk ratio or neither. All right. And so I have another example here where we are going to determine whether we're going to use a risk ratio, an alternate risk ratio, or neither for the identification of Black or African American students as students with a speech or language impairment. All right, so I just want to know if we're going to need to use a risk ratio, alternate risk ratio, or neither. Well, first, once again, we have to go to that numerator risk and see if we met the minimum cell size of 10 and the minimum N size of 30. And so I'm going to go to the group of African American students who have speech or language impairments, right? That value has to be greater than or equal to 10, which we see is 17, so we're good to go there. And I go to the number of students enrolled that are Black or African American, which is 1,124. That's definitely greater than 30. So our minimum cell and N size has been met for the risk for our racial ethnic group, right? So we're going to calculate something. Let's determine whether it's going to be a risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio by looking at the group of all other students, right? With the group of all other students in the district, I can do a subtraction of Black and African American students from our total. And so if I look there, if I look at that 22 total students with a speech or language impairment and subtract off the Black students, I'm only left with 5 students for my cell size. And since that's a cell size and that's less than 10, then I would not calculate a regular risk ratio. I would calculate an alternate risk ratio because that cell size is not met. Even though if I look at the number of students enrolled, I do that 1222 minus that 1124, that's definitely greater than 30. But since that cell size wasn't met, I still go ahead to calculate the alternate risk ratio instead of a regular risk ratio. And so let's look at this example of calculating that value. Again, we're going to do the risk for our Black or African American students for being identified as a student with a speech or language impairment by taking the 17 and divide that by the 1124. And then we use state level data in order for us to get the risk for our comparison group. All right. So I know within your district, you don't have access readily available for state data, but for those alternate risk ratios, we need state level data to do this calculation. And so I need the number of all other students, or the students who are not Black or African American with a speech or language impairment in the state. So I'll take the state total here. I'll subtract off the number of Black or African American students in the state with a speech or language impairment. And I divide that by doing a similar calculation of taking the total number of students enrolled in the state and subtracting from that the number of Black or African American students. And that will give me that denominator risk that I need for my risk ratio. And so all of that information is here. Once you do that calculation, you'll see that you get a risk ratio of approximately 1.14. And so basically we can interpret this as Black or African American students in the district are 1.14 times as likely as all other students in the state, keyword state there, to be identified as a student with a speech or language impairment. Okay, this value is greater than 1, so there is some hints of disproportionality, but that value is not that much greater than 1. And so we'll probably be okay there. But again, there's a comparison of district level data to state level data. All right. This is another example just to quickly review whether we're going to use a risk ratio, an alternate risk ratio, or neither. This time we're going to look at the identification of white students as a student with a speech or language impairment. And so at this point, we want to go over to the category for white students. And if we look, we only have 3 students in our district with a speech who are white that has a speech or language impairment. All right. So since that value is less than 10, we don't meet the minimum cell size requirement. So neither a risk ratio or an alternate risk ratio will be calculated because we don't have a large enough student population with that speech or language impairment. All right. And so neither will be calculated. So, when that's the methodology, at least the calculation part. These are the statistical indices that we use to make a determination about SIGVIS Pro. Once again, we have those 7 categories for identification. We have the 2 categories for placement, and we have the 5 categories for discipline. For each of those categories, there are 7 racial or ethnic groups that we have to make some determination as to whether we use a risk ratio, an alternate risk ratio, or neither. And if we have to do a calculation, we have to calculate that value. So if 14 categories, 7 racial and ethnic groups, that's about 98, or that's equal to 98 data points that we have to conduct or implement in these significant disproportionality analyses. And so this is a lot of information. I do want you to know that in the examples that I presented in the risk ratio and alternate risk ratios, those were all identification categories. And I used the number of students with the disabilities, and I used the student enrollment. I'm going to show you in a few slides what data sets and how we need to disaggregate our data, or at least the data sets we use for the placement and the discipline categories, because they're slightly different. But that's a lot of analyses that we have to do with significant disproportionality. Now to the word significant, that part of disproportionality, right? We said that if it's greater than 1, there's evidence of some disproportionality. What classifies something as significant is up to the state and the stakeholder group who provides input and helps the state set those thresholds. Well, in the identification and placement categories, that threshold is 4.0. Right? So if I calculate a risk ratio, or an alternate risk ratio for an identification or placement category, and I get a value that's greater than 4, that is significant. Any value that's smaller than 4, that's not significant based off of our definitions here. For discipline categories, that threshold is 3.0. So basically what this means is that students in the district are at least 4 times or more as likely to be identified or placed compared to students who are not in that racial ethnic group, either on the district level, if we're using a risk ratio, or the state level, if we're using an alternate risk ratio. So our significant disproportionality, you have to be 4 times as likely for identification and placement. For discipline, you have to be 3 times as likely to be discipline in a certain discipline category to be considered significant. All right. Now, not only do we calculate significant disproportionality for those 98 data points, but the federal government has allowed states to implement some additional factors, since significant disproportionality is high stakes, before they make that designation that a district has significant disproportionality. One of the flexibilities is known as the multi-year flexibility. And so instead of using 1 year of data, we in South Carolina chose to use the 3 most recent years of data that we have in order to conduct significant disproportionality. So for a district to have significant disproportionality, they have to have a risk ratio over those thresholds in the same category for the same racial or ethnic group for each of those 3 years of analysis. Then we may say that that district has significant disproportionality. They will officially be on our radar. They're not fully on our radar because we have another flexibility that the federal government has allowed states to use, which is called reasonable progress. And this applies to those districts who are over the threshold in the same category for the same racial or ethnic group over those 3 years. This applies only to them. And basically how the reasonable progress flexibility works is that if the risk ratios decrease by 0.1 units over that 3-year, not over that 3-year period, for each consecutive year in that 3 years of analysis, then that district has met what we call reasonable progress. That district has met reasonable progress, and they would not be a district that has been identified as significant disproportionality. This applies, however, only to your identification and your placement categories, and it does not apply to that discipline categories, to the discipline categories. This 0.1 unit decrease has been set based off of the input from our stakeholder group. And so that's the value that we use for reasonable progress. And so I have one additional example. It says, use the table of risk ratios below to determine if the district will be classified as a district with significant disproportionality in the identification of American Indian students as students with autism. And this grouping also has Alaskan Native students as well. I forgot to put that there. And so I have some examples of risk ratios. I have a 6.1 during 1 year of the analysis, 4.8 in the other year of analysis, and 4.1. Reasonable progress applies to this because this is an identification category. So what we have to do once we notice that a district has a risk ratio over that 4.0 is we'll look at the difference between the risk ratios in each consecutive years. And if that district is 0.1 or more, then that district would be meeting reasonable progress. but it has to be for all of the consecutive years. So if I look at these first 2 years, 6.1 minus 4.8, that's a value that's bigger than 0.1. And so we're on the road to meeting reasonable progress. And then I look at the second 2 consecutive years, 4.8 minus 4.1, that's also bigger than 0.1. So that state has met reasonable progress because each year they've decreased by 0.1 or more. So this district would not be a district that's identified as a district with significant disproportionality. All right. Now, as I said before, the specific data sets that we used in the examples were all identification. So for the identification categories, we use our child count data, which is part of Table 1, of what we call Table 1, and we use our student enrollment data. This is based off of a day close to the 45th day of school. This is a data set that's given to us from our Office of Research and Data Analysis, and that includes students with and without disability. So it's the entire student enrollment for your district. So we use child count and student enrollment data for all of our identification categories. For our placement categories, we just use child count. So what you submit in your child count report has the race and ethnicity of all of your children with disabilities served with IEPs, and it has the least restrictive environment codes. And so we only rely on that data set to help us with the calculations for the input for the calculations for our placement categories. For our discipline categories, we use the child count, the count of students by race and ethnicity in Table 1. And we also use the discipline report, our Table 5 report that you submit to us each year. Now, when we do this analysis for the 2021-2022 school year, which we're about to conduct and complete, we use the 3 prior years of data in order to make that determination, because we don't have all of the discipline data for the 2021-22 school year yet, and we want all of this information to align. And so we use the previous 3 years of analysis in order to conduct these analyses. So we'll use data from all the way back from 2018-2019 up into 2021 to that school year. All right, so these are our data sets that we're going to use for the significant disproportionality analysis. Now, what are the requirements for significant disproportionality? Well, districts who are identified as a district with SIGDIS Pro must set aside 15% of their IDEA funds for comprehensive coordinated early intervention services, which is known as CCEIS. All right, so you got to set aside 15% of your budget. You have to come up with a plan to use that budget in areas that would address that significant disproportionality. You also have to review your policies, practices, and procedures to see if any of those contribute to the significant disproportionality, and districts are required to publicly report on any revisions that they make to their policies, procedures, or practices once they do that review. Our office works hand in hand with districts. We have technical support from our Behavior Alliance organization, technical assistance support, and they'll work with districts to go through this process of overcoming significant disproportionality. One last thing that I wanted to talk about, and then we'll open the floor for questions, is the difference between significant disproportionality and indicators 4, 9, and 10. Indicators 4, 9, and 10 appear on your district's profile each year, and it also appears in our annual performance report that's submitted to OSEP, the Federal Office of Special Education Programs. Significant disproportionality is slightly different, although we use some of the same data sources and some of the same analyses. They are different, all right? Indicator 4 is what we call significant discrepancy. All right, and indicator 4 focuses only on out-of-school suspensions and expulsions totaling more than 10 days, while significant disproportionality includes identification, placement, and discipline, while one of the categories is OSS greater than 10, we also look at less than 10, and we look at in-school suspensions and total disciplinary removals in significant disproportionality. In addition, another difference between indicator 4, or significant discrepancy, and significant disproportionality is that the federal government requires states to not use the same methodology as they use for significant disproportionality. And so our state, with the help of our input from our stakeholder group, has determined that we'll use rate ratios. And basically what rate ratios are, they provide a comparison of your district rate for students to receive out-of-school suspensions and expulsions totaling more than 10 days, and they compare that to the state rate overall. No matter if I'm looking at all students or students by race or ethnicity, our comparison is always to the state rate. With that rate ratio, there is still a threshold, and that threshold value is 2.5. So if a district has a rate ratio that's greater than 2.5, then they will be identified as a district with significant discrepancy. The stakes with significant discrepancy and indicators 9 and 10 are not as high because you don't have to reserve the 15% of your IDEA funds. We just use that as a trigger to have districts review their policies, practices, and procedures to see if those things may contribute to that significant discrepancy of the reason why you're over that threshold. All right, and that's all districts have to do. And if they find that they have policies, practices, and procedures that contribute, they would have to make corrections, and we'll verify that those corrections have been made at the State Department. Indicators 9 and 10 are both what we call disproportionate representation. Indicator 9 looks at basically over-identification of students with disabilities overall. And then indicator 10, in those same specific disability categories that significant disproportionality uses or analyzes data, we also do that. So we're looking at the disproportionate representation of students with disabilities by race and ethnicity. We are allowed to use the same methodology that we use for significant disproportionality for disproportionate representation. And so we in South Carolina do use the risk ratios and the alternate risk ratios in that analysis. The difference here is that our threshold is 2.5, whereas SIGDIS Pro is 4.0, all right? The other difference is that indicators 9 and 10 focuses on the school age population, whereas SIGDIS Pro with identification looks at the population of student ages 3 to 21. And so those are some of the difference between indicators 4, 9, and 10 and significant disproportionality. Again, if a district is identified with these indicators, they have to do a review of policies, practices, and procedures to see if they contribute to those things. All right, and so for the rest of the time, I have time for questions. But before we get to questions, we do want to let you all know that our April meeting will be recorded. We know that a lot of districts will be on spring break, and a link will be sent via email once that recording becomes available. And so our April meeting will not take place. We will send a link with the pre-recorded meeting. All right, and now we can take some time to ask questions.
All right, I will go ahead and allow the mic for attendees here. I did want to address one question that was in the chat. It looks like it was from Charles Kirtley. He says, it seems that some districts will use their data and some districts will use state data in their calculations depending on the numerator and denominator value. That alternative you are discussing is to compensate for a small denominator. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. So when a district is smaller or they don't have a lot of students in a particular category of race or ethnicity, then they may have that 1 out of 4 that I showed in that example. And so the alternate risk ratio, I guess that's not the best example because that's the numerator, but basically all other students, that population of all other students in the district has to be at least 10 and 30. If it is not, then we have to use the state level data in those cases where that's not the case. Now, if a district has a small population overall of like students in like with a specific disability or students that's placed in a specific setting are a few number of students that is disciplined, then we don't calculate that risk ratio at all, because that target group, the specific racial or ethnic group, is not large enough. When that comparison group is small, we use the state. But I hope that answers your question, is to compensate for those small numbers, those districts with small populations.
All right, the floor is now open for discussion. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves at this point, the floor is now open.
And I'll try my best to answer. Any questions? Yeah, some states have risk ratios. I see that there was that 4.0 is the 4.0 that our state determined as significant, relatively comparable with other states. Some states have risk ratios that are thresholds that are smaller. I don't want to say that ours is on the upper end, because I hadn't looked at all the states, but we have some pretty large values. And so I'll just say that. Thank you, guys. Someone asked, is this meeting being recorded? Where will we be able to get this recording? Yeah, this meeting is being recorded. We'll have to go through some closed captioning processes to get the recording available, but we always have that information available on the data and technology page. We can put that link to all of our data reporting managers trainings. They're all on a page, and we can put the link to that page in the chat.
I'll go ahead and do that. And it's under the data collection and reporting section of the page. You'll see all of the recordings listed there.
Any other questions about significant disproportionality or anything related to some data collections, all that stuff? Thank you. Okay, Amber, I think we can go ahead and stop the recording, and then we'll hang on. I think that's all we have for you guys today. We'll hang on if you have any other questions for a little while. But other than that, thank you guys for attending our March meeting, and we look forward to sending you that link for our April meeting, and then seeing you guys back here in May for our regular meeting.